We're recording. Welcome to Surf the Outer Bits, Digital Preservation Basics. This is being presented by the NCLA Special Collections Roundtable in coordination with the Traveling Archivist Program at the State Archives in Raleigh. Titkemeyer. I'm at Wilson Library at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where I'm a project director on a project to digitize audio materials here at Wilson Library. I am also the Audiovisual Conservator. And I'm going to let Jessica introduce herself.
Hi, Jessica Venlet. I'm the Assistant University Archivist for Digital Records and Records Management, also at the Wilson Special Collections Library. So I work in University Archives on some records management specific things, but I also have kind of a leadership role in how we're doing digital preservation here at Wilson Library.
We just wanted to start with a definition of digital preservation. We pulled from the Digital Preservation Coalition, and that definition is a series of managed activities to continue to materials as long as necessary.
Welcome to WebEx. Enter access code or meeting number followed by pound.
I apologize, everyone. I'm not sure why we're hearing that. All right, everyone. Just again, please keep your microphones muted.
Of digital preservation, Jessica and I want to talk today about the types of activities that are necessary to ensure digital preservation. I'm specifically going to be talking about certain decision-making that takes place prior to digitization, while Jessica is going to be talking more about considerations related to managing born digital storage media, both old and new, and born digital files. And we'll be wrapping up with a few more tips on key activities that go into managing all digital files that you might have, whether that comes from digitization work or from files and then it's born digital. Specifically talking about digitization, I work with folks who are just getting started on digitization projects, or even when we're starting in on something here at UNC. There's different questions that come to mind, and most of them are directly related to improving how we perform digital preservation activities once all of our files have been generated through digitization. So those questions include: what file format do I digitize to? Name the files and how do I keep track of them? Where do I put the files and how much space do I need? So I think all of these questions are really important to consider and relate to digital preservation and inevitably affect the success of digital preservation on the line.
Sorry, I'm talking out loud.
So to answer that first question, what file format do I choose to use as my preservation file format? There are things to consider, and I wanted to first talk about quality of scan and capture and the equipment used. And this is not really directly related to digital preservation, but a lot of times when you're thinking about how you're going to be scanning and digitizing your materials, the hard software that you use is going to dictate some of those decisions you make about what type of files you're going to be creating. So, when looking to create the highest quality possible or create the truest reproduction of an original, you might be thinking about things like resolution, like for photographs, or color space when it comes to any sort of like visual item. And so that's going to be something that really plays a role in the types of equipment that you're choosing. And sometimes equipment that you choose might actually dictate what type of files that you're creating. So that's just important to know if you're in the process of purchasing hardware to do digitization yourself, or if you're working with a vendor who uses specific types of hardware in their own app. So one of the one of the main resources that I really think is important to look at is the sustainability of digital formats made by the Library of Congress, and it gets really in depth about different factors to consider when choosing what formats to use for your preservation standard. But the main one that I thought about, especially when we were choosing our audiovisual preservation standards, was how it had been adopted by our peers. So I think it's really important to look at people who are doing similar digitization work that you're planning on doing and talking with them to see what types of formats that they're digitizing to. Another thing important to keep in mind is the ability of software to bring files back to you so that you can view them easily or play them back, like if it's an audiovisual file. Making sure that there's open, available software to be able to view those files. I've a couple other resources on the right there that are mostly related to decisions that you make about how to get a scan or capture materials. I really like the North Carolina Digital Heritage Center's site. It's very specific and kind of simple as possible, and it talks about the different digitization hardware that they use here at Wilson Library, as well as the format standards that they use. Another thing that's really important to think about is the compression and storage limits that you might have. Here with Wilson Library, with the project that we're working on to digitize AV, which would create really large files, I had to consider all of our different options, including the option of compressing the files so that they take up less space. So, you have the option of uncompressed, which basically means you're not using any sort of techniques to put more bits into smaller files. You have the option of lossless, which means that you are using some compression method, but you're able to, if need be, uncompress the file and you haven't lost any bits, which is different than lossy, which means that you are compressing a file and you're losing bits in the process. Sometimes, especially like with the Library of Congress, the standards that they've set out, a lot of times those standards include creating uncompressed files, and many institutions aren't able to handle the storage requirements for that kind of work. They have to look at other options that might require some form of compression. Relates to the question of what do I name my files and how do I keep track of them. Those are very important questions to ask. People think about digital preservation, they worry about bit rot or bit corruption, files somehow changing over time when they're sitting in storage environments. Really, what I've seen to be the case more often than not is losing track of files or understanding how the file relates to the original physical item that it was created from. And so there are a couple of things to do to help the likelihood of that happening. And just keeping the file names simple, not relying on them to store all of your metadata, because file names can really easily be changed. It doesn't take much just to change a file or even to mistype a file name. So in that way, I always suggest that you make use of embedded metadata or external databases and spreadsheets to keep track of your files. A lot of different file types allow for embedding metadata. We do that for our audio files here. We'll embed the call number for the item that the file was made from within the file, so that even if the file name gets changed, we can still look at that embedded metadata and know where it came from. Spreadsheets are also really great for just sort of keeping track of files. Helpful metadata fields that you can sort of externally that I've seen used here that help us reconnect files to items are things like file size, duration, digitization, checksum strings. So just to go through those, what we do every time we create a file, we have our external database retain those metadata fields. So the ID would be the call number. And so if we kind of like a file in the wild and we're not really sure where it came from and maybe the file name's been changed, we can look at what the size is, or we can look at the duration and potentially from that be able to determine where it might have come from. Digitization can also help because sometimes you can use the date that the file was created to track it back to when it was digitized. And then to explain a little bit about checksum, it's essentially a digital fingerprint that is unique to a file, and there's a number of different tools that we'll bring up later that help you generate those checksums. And what we do is we keep our checksums externally in a database so that, once again, if we have a file and we're sure what it relates to, we can run a checksum, we can find some of it and then sort of come to our database in order to locate what the file, where the file came from. Talk about digital storage. A lot of times it's hard to know how much space you're going to need when you're about to start in on a digitization project. And in those cases, I like to suggest to try a pilot project where you're sort of just creating a batch of what will become a larger batch. And from there you can kind of think proportionally about how much space you're going to need for the larger project. It's also working with a digitization vendor, where, you know, if you're working with a reputable digitization vendor, they should be able to tell you exactly how much space to expect to need for any given digitization project. A lot of times you can also look online. If you know your target file format is going to, you can look online and figure out how much expect per scan of a, you know, photo, or even like for AV per hour or per minute of digitized content. And from there you can sort of estimate how much to plan for. And of course, it's always important to assume additional storage needs to account for backups. So because the project's going, the content that you're digitizing is going to take up 14 gigabytes, you need to consider an additional 14 gigabytes, knowing that you're going to want at least one extra copy. It's good to try and have, threes on different types of media, whether it's a hard drive and then like a network server or a third-party storage. It's always good to mix them up and not have them all on one type of media, not to have all of your copies on spinning disk, for example. It's important to keep things in different geographical locations, or even if you can, just different areas of your institution. I have the example here, the picture of one of our first batches of audiovisual items that we sent out to the vendor, and the resulting hard drives that came back. And we move all of our files off of hard drives pretty much as soon as they get back to us, and we move them onto our institutional servers. But I did use that an example that, you know, hard drives really do start to pile up very quickly, especially if you're doing an audiovisual project. So it can definitely become a bottleneck, especially if you're planning to move the files off of the storage devices that come from the digitization vendors. If you are planning on using hard drives, it's good to just sort of plan for down the road, refreshing them, which basically means moving the files from the original hard drives they're on to newer hard drives, since those also you can have very high failure rates over time. I'm going to pass it on to Jessica, who's going to talk about born digital files and media.
Okay, this is Jessica now, and the first set of materials requiring digital preservation management are born digital materials. What does born digital really mean? This might be kind of a term that you've heard, but maybe you've been wondering exactly what is meant by that. So in all, this term refers to materials that were created in a digital format. The purpose of the term is to differentiate this content from other digital files that resulted from a digitization project. So digital means materials like word processing documents, email, websites, digital photos, and more. And these materials are often found on a variety of digital media like floppy disks, CDs, USB drives, external hard drives, computer hard drives, all of these different kinds of storage locations. So for digital materials you may be interested in preserving will often depend on your local context and what you're collecting at your institution. I would imagine that for many of you it falls either under institutional records or maybe things that have been donated to you. Maybe it's both types. So in either case, the materials will need some level of preservation management, possibly to serve rights management requirements or to kind of fulfill our collection development and access needs. As kind of a little bit of a side note, Born Digital could encompass things like purchase, books, or things of that nature, but I won't be discussing those types of materials today. I also won't be delving too deep into anything really specific to records management, such as electronic records management systems, so we're not really going to talk much about those today. This part of the presentation is more focused on kind of unpublished digital archival materials that may exist in your collections, in your analog collections. Preserving and managing Born Digital materials requires the consideration of both the digital files themselves and the digital storage media that those files currently reside on. So digital materials, both Born Digital and digitized, pose some unique preservation challenges. So I just wanted to kind of go over some of these preservation risks with you. So storage device obsolescence is a big one. So storage devices that we use for our digital stuff change over time, and they change relatively quickly. So if you think about, back in the 90s when you were working with digital things, you were probably saving them on floppy disks. Floppy disks were relatively quickly obsolete as we moved into the 2000s and started using these, or maybe you used zip disks briefly, and then the USB drive, and so on. So the storage that is normal and that we use every day changes pretty frequently, relatively frequently. And our ability to access those older external storage devices becomes more and more difficult over time as hardware changes. So this means that any files left on those devices may be lost if we aren't proactive in moving our digital files to the contemporary, new storage at that time. So we really have to be proactive in making those changes for our storage. Obsolescence is also a potential risk for our digital materials. The software that we need to render files or to open a file on our computers, that software is dependent on specific hardware. And software and hardware both change over time and change relatively quickly, like I was saying about storage devices. So, changes happen. The files themselves that we still, have hanging around on our old storage devices can be hard to open on our contemporary computers because we no longer have the correct software and things like that. So file formats, if we're not if we're not careful, can become incredibly difficult to open and read. And if you can't open and read a file, what's the point? It's not as useful anymore. Another preservation risk is that storage devices can fail or they can be lost. So I don't know about you, but I've definitely lost a USB drive in my life. So storage devices, especially the external convenient storage devices that we often use, can be lost. They can also fail. Sometimes, something could be damaged, and so you can no longer access it because it's damaged. Or, you unplugged it incorrectly, or something happens, and you're no longer able to access that device. If it happens, you can no longer access those files. Accidental deletion is a pretty big risk, I think, when it comes to digital preservation. accidents happen, whether by humans or by a software that you're using. So this is something to keep in mind as well. And then the last preservation risk, and I should say this is not like the ultimate list of preservation risks. Maybe others that I included, but these I think are some of the main ones. And the one that I wanted to highlight is online platform shutdowns. So increasingly we'll see social media platforms that come and go. And the companies themselves may or may not be very proactive about letting users know what's going to happen. So there have been cases where people have lost their content. So it's when you're using a third-party service like a social media service or a cloud service, content is not totally in your control. So there's a risk there that something might happen to that company and may or may not give you an opportunity to get your content out. One example from a few years ago was Ancestry.com's social media component. They had a social media site for a while, and with very little warning to their users, they got rid of it. There was also the Vine app, where you could make like looping videos. That also just last year was discontinued, and they also had some, not the best communication with their users, I don't think either. That's just something to be aware of if you're putting things on social media or other cloud storage, either for storage or just for sharing. There's potential risk there to keep in mind. How might you kind of get started with with figuring what born digital materials might be in your collection? I think, like any good collections project, starting with an inventory of what you have is a really good step. I would suggest creating an inventory of all the digital storage media or files that you currently have in your collection. Think about recording, what devices are there, what types of devices do you have, and can you tell, what content is on the storage device, what collections do the storage devices belong to, and, are you managing institutional records that you and your colleagues are creating, or are you looking more at donated collections, or maybe it's a combination of those things. So I think starting with an inventory, a good old-fashioned spreadsheet of what you have, be a really good place just to have a better sense of that component of your collection. From there, the next step, of course, is prioritization. So none of us have enough time to do every single thing we'd like to do with our collections or to work on every single thing that we have. So prioritizing the materials that you'd like to work on next can be really worthwhile. So the variety of factors I think you could use to prioritize the materials that you're working with. Some examples might be looking at what storage devices are most at risk. If you find a bunch of 3.5-inch floppy disks, you might put those up to the top of the list because that is a very old storage form. And so the sooner you can work with those, the better. You might think about what storage devices will be the easiest for you to access right now. Maybe you have a way to access a 3.5-inch floppy disk right now, but you need a CD drive, so you could work with the CDs that you found. That would be one way to prioritize it. You could also prioritize it by collections, so which collections are most important to you to work on right now. If you're coming at this from a records management kind of context, you think about records management requirements and how that might impact what you prioritize. At this stage as well, it's also a good opportunity to do some appraisal and really think about, this stuff that you're finding, is it really something that you should be keeping or that you need to keep? Do you need to spend time on it? And anytime you can do that sort of appraisal is always a good thing. And some resources on this slide. Some of these resources repeat on the next couple of slides, but these 3 resources I think are really good introductions foreign digital materials and some of the things that go into starting to work with foreign digital materials in your collections and preserving them. So I would highly recommend checking these out as well as you are getting started. To prioritize the digital devices and files in your collections, you can start to sketch out a workflow that will allow you to safely copy files from the current storage device to whatever new storage device as needed. I just mentioned there are resources out there that I think can help you to figure out the best workflow. I think you learn a lot from other people's workflows, but it's also really highly dependent on the resources that you have at your institution, and the technology setup that you have can determine a lot of what you do. The resources that are out there and looking at examples from other institutions, I think can give you a really good sense of the types of things you should be doing and types of tools that you might consider. So the OCLC resources that are linked here and that were linked on the previous slide, I think are really good starting points for thinking about what a workflow should include. But I wanted to just go through a few basic things that I would recommend as kind of a component to the workflows that you might create. So the first thing I think can be useful is to just, after researching and working on your workflow a little bit, think about, designating a storage area where your collection files can copy to and manage. Just kind of like your digital archive storage location, where the only things that are going to be stored there are going to be the collection materials that you're working with. It's not going to be just everybody's storage spot. You can create sort of a designated area that can be a little bit more secure than some of your other storage, where it's only accessed by a few people. It can really help to cut down on some of the preservation risks that mentioned, like accidental deletion or loss or things like that. If it's just a little more clear about who has access and why, and where these materials should be ending up, whether it's foreign or digitized files, what's your kind of your preservation storage? Where is that, and what's it going to be? A long way to protect your collections. I think working with storage devices that you find in collections, another important part to any workflow is assigning unique identifiers to those devices. So as you're copying from one place to another, you have some kind of unique identifier that can help you to know what digital files went with, floppy disks and those kinds of things. Because those relationships might be really important for edition or for research use. I think having that identifier set up is a really good idea. You could use accession numbers or maybe barcodes, depending on your setup. And then the third thing I wanted to highlight is that it's important to think about safely copying the files. I'll talk a little bit about what I mean. I'm not going to get too far into the weeds of all the different types of tools that you could use. That would be like its own presentation, but I just wanted to highlight some considerations here. So any type of storage device, whether it's obsolete or it's current, you want to be careful how you're copying digital files and collections from one place to another. We want to avoid altering anything on the original media storage device or altering the digital files themselves. So it can be important in some collections to retain the original file metadata. So, you want about copying methods that would help you to do that. This is why I kind of recommend doing further research to see what other people are doing in these areas and what the kind of literature recommends, because there are a lot of recommendations out there. So just a couple examples in that area. One thing I did want to mention is that for some of the older storage media that you might have, like floppy disks or 3.5-inch floppy disks, a particular example, you might not have hardware for that anymore, so that might be one of your first barriers to trying to copy material off. And so it's actually surprisingly easy to still get 3.5-inch floppy disk drive. You can get them that are connectable by USB, so they'll connect to a contemporary computer with no problem. You can find these on eBay, at thrift stores, Amazon, all kinds of places. It's still possible to get some of these older drives for flash disks or zip disks and that kind of thing. So those are out there if that's kind of your first barrier to trying to copy things off. One tool I wanted to highlight that can help with safely copying things is a tool called TerraCopy. It's really easy to use, it's free, and it works on Windows only, not on Mac, unfortunately. It can be used to kind of help copy files and not change that last modified date on the file. Another innovation that you'll see in literature and in other people's workflows that I just wanted to mention briefly is disk imaging. So disk imaging is a technique that uses specific tools. Like one example tool is FTK Imager. These tools will basically make a complete copy of a disk. So this includes any empty disk space that doesn't actually have any files on it. It would also include deleted and hidden files. So it's a very specific type of workflow choice. And so you will see that mentioned quite a bit. And it could be a good choice for you if the collections you're working with warrant that. So I just want to mention it because it's something that you will see. The last thing I think can be helpful in any workflow for born digital materials is a step to photograph the original storage devices. We're migrating things off for preservation and for use. I don't want to completely lose that context of whatever was originally used to store devices. So I think having a picture of floppy disks or CDs that can kind of be part of the collection itself may be helpful to researchers. Okay. Sorry, I'm just going to mute someone here real quick. Get a little background. All right. Okay, so the last getting started step I wanted to highlight today is about description and kind of just general organization of the files that you're working with. So once you've copied files to that preservation storage that you've designated, you'll want to ensure the materials are described along with the rest of your collection. Description is really important for preservation as it helps us know what we have and where things are. So, adding things to finding aids, if that's how you're describing things, or potentially catalog records, or wherever you're keeping an inventory or a description of what you have, you'll have to make sure that the born digital materials that you're working with are also included. If working with mostly institutional records and kind of a records management side of things, as you're working with born digital files, I would just add that you might want to describe what you're organizing and where things are, with a specific audience in mind, like your future colleagues or people who work there, after you've left, or if they're colleagues that you're working with right now. As you're doing this, inventorying and finding where all of your digital records are, you'll want to leave behind information for others about those institutional records are and how they're organized. It could also be a good opportunity from a risk management point of view to think about, set a process going forward for how everybody on your team will store files. You might even think about file naming conventions and those kinds of things that might make records management work a little bit easier. So people where things are, and you can keep things moving along as storage changes. And then just two other quick things that didn't really fit in anywhere else in my couple of slides, and I just wanted to mention them, so I've tacked them onto this one. I often get questions about what file formats people should use or what file formats we should accept for donation, if there's anything to prioritize. And I think this can actually be really hard to control, and in some ways I think that people need to just be able to use the software that works best for them and their work. However, with digital preservation in mind, there are recommendations that can be made. So from a digital preservation perspective, it is best to select and recommend file formats that are open and not proprietary. You want them to be well documented and widely used. Kind of like Erica was mentioning earlier about file formats, there are a lot of resources out there that can help you in this area. Like Erica mentioned, the Library of Congress Sustainability of Digital Formats is a good resource. And then on this slide, I've also linked to 2 other resources that I really like. There are lots of others that are out there, but the Wisconsin Historical Society and the NCDCR here in North Carolina has created a digital preservation guidance site. Both of these sites have really specific information about file formats and recommendations about what to use, and are nice resources that I wanted to point out to you all. And the last thing to note on this page is just about web archiving. I didn't talk about web archiving at all today. That could also be its own entire webinar. But I did want to mention that if you have an interest in archiving websites or social media content related to your collecting areas, there is this tool out there called Web Recorder that I really like. It's free, it's super easy to use, although it is a little time consuming, but it's very simple to use and can be a good way to kind of start web archiving without needing a lot of resources. There are also other things that you can use for web archiving, like the Archive It service through the Internet Archive that you may be familiar with, that you pay for. And then there are also other commercial services out there for social media archiving. I don't personally have experience with them, but I know that they're out there. Like one example, one is called Archive Social. So these are just ideas to help you get started and kind of figure out what materials you might already have that would fall into this Born Digital category. So just remember to do further research before you get started and think about how you want to develop a workflow and what will work for your local kind of technology setup. So you might think to yourself, is everything preserved now? Are we all set? Are we done? And to that, Erica and I would say, no, you're not done yet. So digital preservation, whether you have files that come from digitization or a mix of kind of born digital materials and digitized materials, all content will need preservation and management over time. So any other type of preservation is not kind of a one-time thing, but is an ongoing kind of cycle or ongoing management activities that can help keep things preserved. So digital preservation, this is a basic action. It is a pretty complex area of our work in libraries and archives, and not really easy for any institution to do it. We all face challenges with digital preservation, but there are some basics that we can all do to improve the preservation of our digital stuff. So we just wanted to highlight a few more areas and things to keep in mind, and then we should have some time for questions as well. The first thing I wanted to mention was, reviewing your materials. So now that you've done this work, you've done a digitization project, you've inventoried your born digital materials, you've gotten all to your designated preservation storage, hanging out there. Your work is not done. There's more review that you can do to keep these materials in good shape. One thing you might do is some more appraisal of all the digital files, and really think about it can be time intensive to do preservation work. You don't want to spend time on things that you don't really need to be preserving. So I think it's a good opportunity to do some appraisal and think about what really needs that long-term management. An important thing for all the files in kind of your designated preservation storage, is to generate a manifest of what you have and identify file formats and kind of keep that documentation. One tool that can help you do that, it's a pretty easy to use tool, but very powerful, called Droid, and it's also linked on this slide. So whenever I Google Droid, it opens up stuff that is not related. So I have to remember to Google Droid UK National Archives. So this is a tool from the National Archives in the UK. And you can create a manifest of files that will have file paths, file names. It'll identify file formats. It'll document last modified dates. It'll create checksums like Erica had mentioned earlier. It does a lot. And you can export these results into a CSV spreadsheet. That can serve as your documentation of what you have preserved. There are other tools that can also create checksums, and one digital preservation management activity would be periodically validating those checksums to make sure that nothing has happened to your files. So a tool you might use for this is called Bagger, and it's from the Library of Congress. What you would do with Bagger is you would kind of point at the files on in your designated preservation storage, and it would bag them up in kind of a package, sort of like a zip file, if you've ever created a zip file. And checksums for everything inside of that package. So then over time you can use the Bagger tool to validate the files, and it'll let you know if anything has gone awry with those files. An alternative to Bagger that's also useful is called Fixity. It's all linked on this slide, and that's from AV Preserve. And as I mentioned, Droid will create checksums, does not validate them. It does that functionality. I mentioned under reviewing files is just keeping description up to date. As we've mentioned, description is actually a really important part of digital preservation because it helps us to know what we have, why it's important, why we kept it, why we're preserving it. So it's an important component. Another ongoing part of digital preservation management is backing things up. Erica did a great job of talking about this earlier when she was talking about storage. You want to make sure that the collections that you have are backed up, whether it means having multiple external hard drives or able to use a server, or you have some backup software, utilizing that software to make sure that your files are protected from accidental deletion and those things, so you can recover those files. To recap, Erica had mentioned, using a variety of storage. Maybe it's a server if you can, and an external drive, or maybe there's an external hard drive and a cloud service that you'd like to use. Different options. And Erica had also mentioned, having 2 to 3 copies of your materials, which I think is doable for you. You at least want one backup, but if you can have a couple more, that can be useful as well. And then the third thing we wanted to reiterate for digital preservation management is just making sure that you control a copy of your data. So this goes back to when we're thinking about the preservation risks around social media sites and online platforms. You're only storing things in the cloud if that's where all your only copy of things lives. That's potentially putting your materials at risk. So whenever you can, you want to think about keeping that local, having a local copy that you control. All right. And it's also important to refresh storage devices. And so this, I think Eric mentioned this as well, and it was really a good point that you want to keep your storage devices up to date over time. So as we had also talked about related to born digital materials, our storage devices change, and so we need to be about what we have currently stored and how we might need to migrate it forward to something new. And that is best. It's just a repeating. These are steps that you will do for as long as you need to preserve whatever it is you're preserving. And a less frequent but important activity that we also wanted to mention is reviewing file formats over time to assess any preservation or access issues that might come up. So we didn't talk in depth at all about file format migration. Personally, I think it's one of the most challenging parts of digital preservation, and it's a pretty advanced activity. But we want to mention that there are resources out there on that. So if you ever find you're having trouble accessing something, there are resources that you can look into in this area as well. So the very last thing that we wanted to mention, and I will say too, I see some questions coming to me as well, so I'll take a look at that in just a second. But the last thing that we wanted to say is just that if you take one thing away from this webinar and from getting started with thinking of digital preservation, is that there's a lot of learning to do for all of us, even for those of us who have experience and have been doing this. There's a lot to learn, and new methods are being introduced and talked about all the time. So a big part of this is just be open to learning new things and trying your best to keep up with advancements to improve your local digital preservation work. That concludes our presentation. Looks like we have about 10 minutes left. We created this Google Doc with all of our resources in it. It's a very long URL, but I believe we can send out the slides to those of you who had registered or who are attending to make sure it's a little easier for you to get to the resources we've recommended. So at this point, it looks like some of you have sent some questions to me privately. So I will take a minute to just look at those. Let's see here. So one thing, if you look at the chat box, you'll have an option to send something directly to me or to everyone. So for those of you who might have a question at this point, if you want to just send it to everyone, that would be great. And then I'm just going to take a minute and look at the ones that were sent to me. So there was a question from Eric that is, what is the issue of naming files with certain data searchable in the drive? Sure. I think
that might be in reference to when I was talking about not all the metadata into the file name. And I think whatever strategy you have for naming files that make it easy to search, you should go for it. I think the purpose of my comment was to say that you should be relying entirely on the file name to tell you what original physical item it came from. So, like, say you have a video that's been digitized and you're using a call number as file name, so that you know if you get file, it's the digitized version of that item. What I was saying was that it's important to either embed metadata in that file or have another system, external system like a database, in order to be able to reconnect that file to the original item. But I think using your metadata as a file name is fine. It's just that it shouldn't be the only place where that metadata exists.
Great. There was also a comment from Laurel Reinhardt, who mentioned that who used an old software, she mentions AppleWorks. LibreOffice will open those files, and it is free. And so this is, thank you for the comment, Laurel. This is a good thing that I didn't mention, and that's good to point out. Some of these older file formats that you might see, like AppleWorks, I see WordPerfect a lot, and there have been some others. There are sometimes workarounds, even if you don't have that old software anymore. So you might be able to use something like LibreOffice. There's a tool you can purchase called QuickView Plus that can help, and sometimes you can you can some of the text, though the formatting is off, if you open a file in like a text editor. So even if you don't have the software, there are sometimes workarounds that can help you with appraisal and things like that. But also jogging another recommendation that as you're working with these older born digital files and you copy them off, the original device, make another copy that you can use to view, look at the files. So say you don't want to do anything on the original device, you want to copy things off, then maybe that clean copy and then have another copy where you can just look around and sort of figure out what's there and do some appraisal. Let's see, Laurel also had a question about, we have microfiche, how expensive is it to digitize this? Is it better to get our own device or farm and use a vendor?
I'm not sure of what the rates are right now for scanning microfiche, but I will say I'm not familiar with too many people are doing it in-house, and I imagine that's because the vendor costs are really cheap compared to your own equipment, maintaining it over time, and hiring someone to run it. So, I mean, my initial response would probably be to outsource it, but some other folks who may be doing it in-house might have something else about that. I just know that usually the case at this point is that it's fairly cheap to outsource.
There was also a question from Lori that's in the chat box. I think everyone should be able to see this one. Does it have suggestions for cataloging software for digital images for a historic photo collection? I really don't. This is Jessica. I don't know if Erica has any comments.
I guess I wonder what you mean by cataloging software. If you mean software to of the photo collection, or
to hold the metadata for the photos.
Photos, I don't think I'd have a suggestion for that. I know, like, we use Adobe Bridge to embed metadata, and I would look into Adobe Bridge. I'm not familiar with its like functionality.
It looks like these suggestions around content management systems like Mecca or something that might be able to help. That was from another attendee in the chat box. I think everyone can see that. And when it comes to kind of access and delivery of files, I'm sure there are lots of things out there. It looks like Eric had a similar question around online software for access to the collection. And again, we didn't necessarily prepare a lot of stuff around sort of the access side of things today, but I think there are a lot of many types of things out there.
I think Mecca is usually the go-to that a lot of folks use, especially when you're dealing with just smaller collections where there's maybe not a whole lot of material to share. That's what I've heard, that it's worked best with smaller collections.
So I have a couple more questions, or a couple more minutes. So if anyone else has questions for us, you can put those in the chat box. Otherwise, I would think how the email is going out. I don't know if you'll be able to see each other's emails. Some of the questions around the access platforms and things like that. Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. I want to thank everybody for attending today. We appreciate your time and hope that this was helpful. This session was recorded, so I believe that the recording will be sent out, and we'll also include slides so that you can get to all of the things, the resources that we were linking to. And